Hey guys, welcome back. So this week we're going to focus on HPV and maybe a couple, not really a couple, maybe one other disease if we've got time for it. But I think for the most of this week we're going to focus on HPV, um, namely because it's one that I think people have heard but don't really know a lot about or haven't paid attention to a lot of, and I want to talk about why it's important to be aware of this one in particular. And you probably heard more about it in recent years with the Gardasil vaccine and all that, but we're going to talk about it this week. Normally, I would show a movie for this topic. There's a really good movie I watched in college. It's a documentary, kind of, I guess if you would call it that, following the lives of 5 different women and their experiences with the virus. But obviously, I can't do that now because I can't share that online. That would be illegal. Um, but maybe we'll find a workaround. Maybe I'll show like one scene or something. I don't know what the stipulations are. But either way, today I'm just going to talk about what HPV is, why it's important to know about it, like what it can lead to. I'm going to talk about this again real quick here and give my kind of overview about it. And then I'm going to kind of commentate through a video that I'm going to show. If you don't want to watch my commentary, you can watch it on your own. I'm also going to link it by itself on the Google Classroom, but it does go into some specifics in terms of like, it uses a lot of scientific terminology that'll probably be really confusing out of context. So that's why I'm going to commentate on it and not just link it by itself. But like I said, it's optional if you want to do that. So anyway, HPV stands for Human Papilloma Virus. I mentioned this when we went over all the STDs just in general. A papilloma is a growth on the skin or a type of either a wart or a tumor, depending on the situation, if I understand correctly. You will get there. Either way, so this virus in particular, this STD, is most often related to genital warts. But in some cases, it can lead to certain types of cancer, cancer of the prostate, cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries, penis, anus, all that, basically wherever the affected area is. It can lead to cancer in severe cases and with certain strains of HPV. However, in most cases, and this is part of the reason why most people don't know a lot about it or haven't heard a lot about it in general. I don't know how many of you have heard of this disease, but a lot of people don't really pay attention to this one because most of the time people don't even know that they have it. It doesn't manifest symptoms in a lot of people, and it normally clears itself up on its own. It's not permanent, and your body will normally fight off the virus after a certain amount of time, and you might not even know that you had it. Like I said, sometimes it doesn't even have enough time to manifest symptoms, which is why a lot of people ignored it for a really long time. However, like I said, since it can lead to certain types of cancer in severe cases, it is important to know about, and that's why it's been gaining a lot of traction recently, especially with, again, like I said, the development of the Gardasil vaccine, and why it's so important that people get that. So, I'm going to let this video play. Again, if you don't want to watch me commentate over the video, feel free to watch it on your own, but you might have some questions. I'm going to post a couple questions on there we go, on a Google form just to make sure that you participated and make sure that you watched the video and know what we're talking about this week. This is just kind of setting the stage for actually getting into it. This is just talking about what HPV is and what it causes, and why it's important. Tomorrow we're going to look at the Gardasil vaccine itself, talk about when it was developed, why it's important, who should get it, when you should get it, all that stuff. And then Thursday, I'm still kind of tossing up in the air because, like I said, normally I'd show a movie. Maybe I'll show like a scene or a clip or something. I'm thinking if I can maybe get if I could get something like that. But I might have to adjust it depending on if that's allowed or not. So we'll see. Thursday's kind of up in the air, but we'll get there. So again, I'll let this play. Let me credit the person real quick, just for the sake of. Oh, it's osmosis.org. It's right on the screen. So anyway, check out their video. Like I said, I'll link it by itself, so it's not just me talking over it. But I wanted to clarify a couple things while this played. Oh, not skip to the end. Okay. So we'll let this play. My computer's being real slow. There we go.
Learning medicine is hard work. Osmosis makes it easy. It takes your lectures and notes.
This is just advertising the website. You can check that out if you want.
Human papilloma viruses, or HPV for short, are a group of non-enveloped DNA viruses that specifically infect human epithelial cells. There are over 100 different types of HPVs, which can be...
Okay, so first thing, they're going to talk about this more in a second, but I just want to clarify before we get into that. An epithelial cell is epithelial. I slurred that. Epithelial cells are basically your skin cells, and it's oversimplifying it a little bit, but they're going to talk about specifically, basically anything that lines the outside of your body and the layers that make up your skin. So even the stuff that's not directly on the outside of your body if it's skin tissue, it's considered an epithelial cell.
Be categorized by the epithelial cells they prefer to infect, like cutaneous epithelial cells of the skin, especially the face, hands, and feet, and epithelial cells of mucous membranes, especially the respiratory tract including the pharynx and nasal and oral cavities, and anal and genital regions. Some types can cause benign tumors, called papillomas or warts, and some can lead to carcinomas, or cancer of the epithelial cells. HPV may have contributed to both actor Michael Douglas's throat cancer diagnosis and former First Lady separate the interior of the body from the external world.
So again,
they primarily...
here they're just going to explain, they're going to give more of a more specific definition of what an epithelial cell is. If this is confusing to you, just to summarize it in words that make the most sense. Again, this is oversimplifying it, but for our purposes, it's skin tissue.
Serve as a protective barrier to invasion by pathogenic bacteria, fungi, parasites, and viruses, and to water loss. In locations like the skin, anus, genitals, and respiratory tract, they can be stratified, having more than one layer of epithelial cells. At the base, the layer closest to the interior of the body, these cells are less mature, rounded stem cells, also called basal cells. Basal cells divide and replenish all the cells found in the epithelium. As the basal cells divide and mature, they move toward the outermost layer, flattening out and becoming more squamous-shaped in appearance. Once they reach the top layer, these mature, flat cells are exfoliated or shed from the epithelium. Now, typically, basal cells are well protected under all those layers. But if there are abrasions or cuts in the epithelium, HPV can gain access to and infect the basal cells. Once that happens, HPV can replicate with or without being incorporated into the basal cell's DNA through the activities of two particular viral genes called E6 and E7.
Okay, so real quick, I want to clarify a couple things. He's going to talk about these genes that are affected real quick after this. Don't worry about that. It's a lot of terminology that we haven't talked about and we're not going to discuss in this course. Just talking about what the genes do and how they relate to cancer regulation. What I want to talk about is this mode of infection here. So again, this is interesting in that HPV infections don't necessarily have to be blood-to-blood or bodily fluid exchange. It can be skin-to-skin contact if there are abrasions, cuts, things like that. That's what makes it unique in terms of other STDs. It's a little bit more easily transmissible. And they talk about this a little bit in that movie that I would have shown, but again, I don't think I'm going to be able to show that. But it's a little bit more easily transmissible in that it can be transmitted from just skin-to-skin contact. It's still considered an STD because it's mostly sexual contact that passes it on, but it doesn't necessarily have to be what I said before. I'm losing my train of thought. But anyway.
The proteins of these genes cause dysregulation.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because he goes into a lot of detail about the genes and I don't want to confuse you too much.
And disrupts the normal structure of the epithelium, forming lesions.
So essentially what he summarized there in that big section that I just skipped is that these viruses attack certain genes in the DNA that would normally regulate cell growth. When those genes are interrupted, cells grow uncontrollably, which normally leads to the formation of these warts or lesions, which, if you remember back to my initial PowerPoint, this is the reason why HPV has been linked to genital warts as well as just warts in general. When the cells divide uncontrollably, they lead to these growths and formations on the skin, which is also why, and they're going to talk about this in a second, in more severe cases, it can lead to cancer development because cancerous cells are just cells that experience uncontrolled cell growth.
In some types of HPV...
I'm going to skip this part because it's not super important for right now and I don't want to make this video longer than it has to be. Here we go.
And invade other tissues.
So, real quick here, I skipped over this, but I just want to talk about it real quick. These types of cells here that are forming from the infected HPV cells can lead to precancerous cells. A precancerous cell is a cell that is not necessarily cancer yet, but it has the potential to develop into something more serious. Doctors are usually on the lookout for these whenever they provide certain tests, and this is usually when they would start to refer you to an oncologist. They say, like, we're noticing some unusual cell growth, we're noticing some precancerous cells. It doesn't mean that you have cancer yet, but you should definitely be on the lookout for something like that.
The cause of HPV infection is contact with infected epithelial cells.
So again, it could just be skin to skin. It doesn't have to be bodily fluid exchange.
Some activities can increase the risk of exposure, like having multiple or new infected sexual partners.
This is all common sense stuff that applies to STDs in general. So like multiple partners, unprotected sex, risky behaviors, things like that.
Or delivering a baby through an infected birth canal.
I mentioned this during
And infections are more
my PowerPoint when we went through STDs too, so I talked about that there. If you don't remember that, go back to that PowerPoint.
likely if a person is already immunocompromised. Transformation to carcinoma is dependent on HPV type and is aided by other cofactors like tobacco use, immunosuppression, and radiation. Now, many HPV infections are asymptomatic, but when symptoms are present, they can vary by HPV type.
Asymptomatic meaning that there's no symptoms, and I already mentioned that. Most people that have HPV infections don't even know that they had it. A lot of people will go their life never knowing that they had an HPV infection.
So, symptoms of non-genital cutaneous infections can involve some kind of benign wart. Common skin warts of the hands or nails are typically painless, dome-shaped projections that give the skin a rough appearance. Plantar warts on the soles of the feet can be painful.
I'm going to skip this part for the sake of time. He just talks about the different types of warts. Again, that is there's kind of a ranking in terms of like symptoms. Obviously, least severe symptoms are asymptomatic. You don't have any symptoms, which are a good chunk of people. Obviously, like more like pronounced symptoms, but still not that severe are these types of warts. These warts aren't permanent, and you can get them removed or they'll go away on their own. So he's just talking about the different types of warts, and then they get on to the more dangerous ones, the precancerous ones that could eventually lead to the development of certain cancers.
So the cervix, vagina, vulva, penis, anus, or upper respiratory tract over 1 or 2 decades.
So again, notice I skipped right past this part, but it depends on the type of virus. There are different strains of virus, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Only certain strains have been linked to or are more likely to develop into cancerous tissues, and where the cancer develops depends on obviously where the tissue is infected. So basically where it came in contact with the infected tissue. So that will determine where the cancer develops.
Warts are used to diagnose HPV, particularly in cutaneous infections. Infections of mucous membranes may require additional interventions to visualize epithelial cells. An endoscopy, a tube with a camera at the end, may be needed if an infection of the upper respiratory tract is suspected.
Mucous membranes meaning anywhere that's epithelial, meaning it's exposed to the outside, but it's not outside your body. So like your skin is external, and if you had an infection on the epithelial surface of your skin, you could obviously test that very easily. Mucous membranes are the epithelial tissues that line the inside of your body. So your esophagus, your respiratory tract, your reproductive urinary tracts, anal tract, digestive tract, those kinds of things, which again, they're still exposed technically to the outside world, but you'd have to have some kind of internal tests in order to get those done.
And regular Pap or acetic acid tests of the cervix after 21 years old, even if symptoms are subclinical. But a definitive diagnosis of HPV cannot be made without molecular testing of biopsied cells for viral DNA or RNA.
So, what they're talking about here are testing methods. The biggest thing are Pap smears, papilloma tests for girls, which is the easiest way for women to get tested. I'm not sure if there are many, or I'm not sure what avenues you can take for men to get tested, but typically women are tested for this more than men due to the risk of cervical cancer. Men don't have a cervix, so there's no risk of cervical cancer. However, obviously men are susceptible to other types of cancer, but those are tests that are normally done in conjunction with HPV tests. So the reason why they put such a big emphasis on Pap smears is because that test is specifically designed to look for infected tissue in the cervix, and it is specifically designed to look for the HPV virus. That's why it's called a Pap smear, papilloma. So it's important that for girls to be getting regular Pap smear tests when you are recommended that by your doctor, your gynecologist. It's a very good method of being ahead of the curve and making sure that you don't get behind on anything. It's one of those things, it's the same thing with all types of cancer. You want to catch it early on before it develops into something dangerous. So it's best to get regular tests and just be aware of it than to get kind of like caught off guard one day and suddenly it's a stage 4 cancer that's already spread to other parts of your body. That would not be very good. We talk about this more in class because, again, it's a big part of the movie that I would show. But we'll talk about it tomorrow with the Gardasil article and all that stuff too. Anyway, I skipped a lot of this video. I don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be because I realize that you guys are going to probably zone out if I make this too long. So I'm going to cut it off here. If you want to watch more of this video, if you want more information, feel free to watch through it on your own. Just be aware there are a couple images that they're not awful, they're just hand-drawn, but if you're like squeamish and just don't like looking at or thinking that kind of stuff, they are depicted there. But either way, I'll post a couple questions about this video or about stuff that I covered just to make sure that you watched this, or at least you're participating for today. And then tomorrow, like I said, we're going to talk about preemptive measures, we're going to talk about pap smear tests, we're going to talk about the Gardasil vaccine, when it was developed, why it was developed, all that fun stuff. Anyway, so let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you fill out that Google form, and we will continue this discussion tomorrow.